Hello, welcome to the Christmas lectures here at Staffordshire University. I am Ben Rimmer, and with me today is...
Jamie Nicholas, hello.
And we're going to be your hosts and presenters today for our wide selection of talks that I will be hosted on our YouTube channel. And with us this morning, we have Professor Christopher Headleand, who's going to give us a talk about where a career in the games industry can take you. So I'll bring Chris in. He can get started for you.
Yeah. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Good morning, afternoon, one of the two. It's that odd time in the midday. So, quick talk on where a career in games can take you. So, one of the things I find as a games academic generally, but also now as a head of department and professor, is there's a whole bunch of questions I tend to get asked at open days, or if I do a careers event, or if I'm speaking to families. And I've lifted some of these up on the screen along with a confused looking Santa Claus. Firstly, are there lots of jobs in the games industry? If I do a degree in games education of some sort, I'm only qualified to make games. Is this all I'll be able to do? And another question is, do games get made outside of the games industry broadly? Games is kind of a maturing industry. So video games specifically have only been around in relatively recent memory, compared to some, I suppose, more traditional industry like engineering, which has been around since the wheel. So knowing and really having that experience and for potentially the people who are advising us on our careers, that knowledge doesn't always exist in the system. So I want to try and hopefully dispel some rumors, bring in some facts, and hopefully give you some information to make a decision whether a degree in some sort of game study is right for you. Now, this should be a relatively short talk, but hopefully a useful one. So first, a little bit about me. I have a degree in computer science, a PhD in computer science, a degree in design, but I've worked in a whole range of areas before and while I've been in academia. I've worked in games industry. I run a small games company. I have worked in graphic design. I worked in fashion for a relatively short amount of time as a freelancer. I was in innovation management for a while, education, and some could argue I still am in education. I worked in heritage, but also in web systems development. So as I suppose as an example of somebody with game skills, these are the kind of areas that I have worked in. And there's one actually I forgot to put up in there, which was logistics management and software development, two places that I have done work in. I also want to give you a bit of an introduction to the games department at Staffordshire University. This is our 20 years of games. So we have been teaching, we have had games courses at Staffordshire University for 20 years. We're celebrating this years of excellence, and really that a testimonial to our students and staff who have made us a really successful department. And we're at the point where we've grown to certainly the largest department in the UK and one of the largest in the world. And I've thrown this slide in here to just give you a quick sense of what our journey's been like for the past 20 years, from launching our first degrees on our original Stafford campus, all the way through to today, where we have around 1,550 students studying games development topics, more if we include the people studying things like esports and VFX and these kind of games-related disciplines, and where we are an award-winning, really proactive department. And this year has been a massive year for us as well. We've had some huge award successes for the department. We were shortlisted for 6 industry awards. And we ended up winning Best Arcade Game for MechHead, which is a game that was built to teach with, but we ended up developing with staff and students into a commercial offering. So we actually put a video game that our students built into an industry awards, and they won, which we're incredibly proud of. Over the past few years, we've received a number of awards in this space for Best Educational Initiative for our award-winning One-Up scheme, where we effectively employ students to run our pop-up game studio, Bulldog Studios, through the summer. And we've also, this year, with something we're really proud of, we were ranked the top UK games department by the Rookies. And if you're not aware of what the Rookies is, it's, I suppose, the the main kind of global ranking for creative subjects. So 7th in the world and number 1 in the UK. And again, as head of department, I'm incredibly proud of that. So to go back to the questions that we opened with, how big is the games industry? Well, the reality is that it's huge, absolutely massive. It's estimated to be worth around 300 billion. And we're showing significant growth as well, to the point where that is almost expected to double, or at least around double, over the next few years. The games industry is completely ubiquitous now. There's almost, if you've got a mobile phone, you have a device capable of playing a video game. And a lot of people engage in games all the time and don't even realize it, and don't really even recognize that they are playing games. They're passing the time there. Doing stuff on the train that maybe you don't even recognize the game, that is a game. But also, if we go back even just a few years, say 10 years, the amount of people who owned home devices, such as PCs or consoles, capable of playing video games was really small compared to where we are now, where the vast majority of the population have access to some system that can play video games, and most people have access to the internet. I mean, the internet is obviously described as a basic need at this point, with certain even government services being delivered almost exclusively through websites. So the point we're at now is so far apart from where we were before, and it is continuing to grow as these pieces of technologies become increasingly ubiquitous. And this growth has been robust. It has been, and I mentioned at the beginning, we've moved away from the games industry into a really mature, really professional industry, really structured. We see these massive studios who employ thousands of people. It is really a growth sector. And what is really interesting is that the games skills and the games technologies are branching out of the games industries and starting to influence other sectors as well. Most of this I'll discuss as we go through my next set of slides. But some things I'll just touch on here. One of the things that we do very well as games scholars, as games professionals, is work with real time. So real-time data, real-time imagery, real-time visualization. Now, those skills are increasingly in demand everywhere, from the film industry to the automotive, anywhere that you want to visualize something complex or want to give users an ability to immerse themselves in a simulation or environment or some sort of data, you effectively require the skills of a games developer or games designer, games artist. So I touched on there very briefly, film and television. One of the things that we've seen a massive shift in film and television is the use of games engines and game skills in the production of modern productions and development of modern productions. So one thing that we see a lot of now, which again wasn't a thing not too long ago, is the use of games engines and 3D assets in set development and virtual production. For example, if you wanted to trial a set, if you wanted to understand what a set could look like, go back not too long ago and you'd have to build that as a physical model out of card or clay or foam board. And that was an entire skill set in itself. You'd have these big drafting rooms where people would be making teeny tiny chairs to visualize what a set could look like. Now, this works fine. And there's still people who do that. This is still a skill that exists. And again, if you want to see some examples of that, a really good one is walking around the Harry Potter studios. There's examples of those miniatures everywhere. However, one of the things that proved challenging is actually an understanding of perspective. When you're doing things small, it doesn't necessarily come across the way it's going to come across on camera. And it can be difficult for different people to understand what that's actually going to look like. You can't shrink yourself down and have a walk around a set model, for example. And actually there is some examples where people try to do that with small cameras on sticks that they'd move around the space. But it's much easier to build it in a games engine. Using assets that maybe you already have available, or the ability to knock up something that is going to be very specific to that environment and see what it looks like we can now build those environments in a games engine and even allow the actors or the production or the camera crew to put on virtual reality and walk around and see what that will look like. That means we can pick up things from different angles, things from different perspectives. We can understand the lighting a lot better. And we can trial different things out in that virtual space that we might not have been able to do as easily in a model. Now, that's one end of the spectrum, the sort of virtual set design. On the other end of the spectrum, we have virtual production. And that is what I've stuck the image on there. So historically, if you wanted to film something in an outlandish world that you wanted to build in CGI, you tend to film everything against green screen. So if you've not seen green screen before, it's exactly what it sounds like. You have a green backdrop, and then you use computers to effectively remove the green and replace it with a scene that you want to. Virtual production does away with the need to do that. And what it allows us to do is effectively have and this is in very, very simplistic terms, a giant monitor where people can act in front. So effectively, we can allow our actors to step into a world that we've produced in a games engine. So this is all powered by the Unreal Engine, in our example. And this is our virtual production set here at Staffordshire University. It's one of the few universities who is lucky enough to have an Insight virtual production. Now, this is where a lot of films are going. So if you've seen things like The Mandalorian, a lot of the environments there aren't physical sets. They're actually walking in front of a stage, a virtual production stage, very similar to this. And you can make those look now with modern technology, you can make those look absolutely seamless. So if you think of the power of that, you can design a set in virtual reality and allow people to walk around, see what it's like, understand that space, plan your shots, plan your lighting. But then you can take exactly that same planned game world and then move it just with a touch of a button, move it into a virtual production space and film directly in front of it. It speeds up pipelines. It hopefully makes the actor's job a little bit easier as well. In green screen, if you ever watch, and I encourage you to, if you look at how people do CGI green screens, there's often points of focus. So there is somewhere where you want your actor to look because they're talking to a dragon or they're looking at an explosion off in the distance that doesn't actually exist. It's going to be put there in post. So what you do quite often is you'll have a green stick with a ping pong ball at the end, and you'll use that to direct the vision of the actor. Look at this thing. Again, some fantastic examples of this. Have a look at things like Lord of the Rings. There's loads of this stuff that happens there. The advantage with virtual production is all those things can be happening around the actor. We can build, rather than having to build it all in post, we can put it straight into the virtual production stage. So if there's an explosion, we can create that explosion in virtual production, giving the actor a point of focus. It also means the lighting is, we have some different solutions we can apply to lighting. So if you look at this picture, there's a big square white box floating above. That's effectively another one of these screens. So we can change the lighting of that to different colors, different temperatures to mirror the environment that we're in, effectively creating a simulated sky. And again, the possibilities with this technology are absolutely endless, and it really is where the kind of CGI film production space is moving. In addition to all this, there's loads of jobs in traditional CGI and VFX where those game skills of understanding the world in 3D, understanding how to visualize something are really, really valuable. Another example I like to talk about is advertising and marketing. I've put up some titles on there as an example I'll discuss at the end. Advertising and marketing is increasingly going interactive because we want people to feel engaged by the products or services that we're trying to sell. Gamification is a massive part of the advertising agency at the moment. And again, people who understand games, game designers who understand making things playful and enjoyable are really valued in this space. But we're also seeing things like interactions design. Now, interaction design is it's effectively a branch of design where we look at sculpting how people engage with a certain activity. How do they interact with it, and designing that in a way that is fun and enjoyable, engaging for them. Now, a lot of interaction designers are coming from the games industry because games designers understand this process. We know what happens when effectively how to trigger people in a positive way using feedback loops and mechanics of gameplay, we understand interaction design very, very well. So we're seeing a lot of game designers move into interaction space in advertising and marketing. I also have personal colleagues who've moved into being creative directors of advertising agencies or even campaign managers and producers. Again, from a games production sense, a lot of what we do to produce a creative product maps over to a whole bunch of other industries. So if you can produce a game, you can produce a creative campaign, you can produce, there's a whole range. Right? Production is a skill set in itself of effectively project management. And those transferable skills are really valued elsewhere. There's also something I did want to bring up, which is this idea of advergaming. Now, I find this is a fantastic example of gameplay. So some of the most popular games or some most played games of all time have actually been adverts. And again, we might even not recognize that they're adverts while we were playing them. And I've put some of the big examples on the screen. I mean, these are fairly old. These are from my era. But we see them all the time. And again, lots of advertising agencies will use games as a way to promote products in a very specific way. So the classic example of this is one called Chex Quest, which is just fantastic. And the history of that is really interesting. And we're actually doing a talk on games history with David Murphy as part of the Christmas lectures. Maybe we'll touch on some of this. I really encourage you to go to that talk. But Chex Quest was really interesting. They took an existing game, which was Doom, the very early first-person shooter Doom, and they rebranded it as a piece of cereal going around shooting aliens. It was, again, a genius piece of marketing. It was really popular. And again, of that year, it was one of the most popular games played. There's been loads of M&M's games. There's a long history of, for example, car manufacturers developing games around their new releases. BMW have done this a few times. One of the most popular racing games on the Sega Mega Drive was called Lotus. And again, you drove a new Lotus Elise when the Elise was just coming out. Again, massively popular games, really raised the profile of those manufacturers to an audience that weren't at an age where they were able to buy cars at that point, but maybe consider it down the line. And again, to this day, I could ring out some of the specs from the Lotus Elise because I've remembered it from that game. Architecture is another place where we've seen a lot of people with games education move into. Now, not just the architecture that might be familiar with, so designing houses or design buildings, but actually how we're designing how space is used as well. Now, artists, I've seen artists going through conceptualization. So again, the picture I've got here is an example of some of this, different ways of rendering a building so it can be understood. For example, I've just had an extension design for my house, and the architect went out to get concept art produced for that. So I could gain an idea of what this extension would look like. How is my new house going to work? So conceptualization, but also architectural visualization. Going back to that idea with models that I mentioned in the film piece, the traditional way that we sort of demonstrated how buildings worked is we would build a model. We would build a maybe 1 in 20th size model to show that people could walk around and people could see. But what they couldn't get a measure of necessarily was what it felt like to walk out of the elevator. How does the flow through the building feel? Is the cafeteria in a place that makes sense? How does this feel as a space? When we look at buildings, we often talk about flow. How are we flowing through the space? Are all the rooms easily accessible? Do we get good views? What do the views look like? Now, the way we'd approach those traditionally is by trying to render those out. So we'd build, additional models showing additional parts of that building, or we might render, we might draw what the view out of a specific window would look like. Or again, in recent eras, I've seen drones being flown to specific points where we'd see a window and get them to take photographs out of that space. So we can get an idea of this will be what the view from the penthouse will look like. This will be what the view from the back bedroom looks like. And all that's really interesting, and it works. But what games give us an opportunity to do is to build that building virtually before we build it physically. We can actually test out a space using, sometimes we call them digital doubles, a double of that building. We can put on virtuality, we can walk around that building, we can understand it, we can see, again, even down to the point of where should we put the light switches? Is the best place on the right-hand side of the door or the left-hand side of the door? How frequently should we have the toilets in the building? What's the flow through that space going to be? And we can test that. We can put on virtual reality, we can walk around, and we can do that piece of work. And I'm seeing that increasingly become a modern and useful way to assess buildings. Now, a really interesting example that I was involved with a couple of years ago was about accessibility and wheelchair usage. Now, what we were able to do in virtual reality was to recreate some of the challenges that a wheelchair user may be able to experience around a building. We can test it from wheelchair users' perspective. We could give a wheelchair user and virtual reality the ability to explore a building. Now, that meant they could identify challenges that might have only really highlighted themselves through the production deployment of that building. So once the building's actually been handed out, passed over to the new owners. Now, at that point, it might be too late to actually make corrections and make changes. But by doing this testing earlier in the phase, virtually, we have loads of opportunities. There's also the idea of space planning. So space planning, yes, that can be in buildings, but it can also be outside and exterior usage. So how do people use space? And people often use space in fantastic and wonderful ways that you don't really expect in the planning. For example, when you walked home from school, when you try and go to the shop, how many shortcuts might you take that people may not have planned for? Like, have you walked through any car parks that weren't really designed for pedestrian usage? Did you jump a fence? Sure, nobody ever has, but maybe I did once or twice in my youth. If we look at a field, we'll put a path through that field, but is that the route that people go? Do you know a park where there is an unofficial path that has just been created by people walking over it for so many years? How we think people use space on paper versus how they will do in practical sense is often quite different. Now, something that I find games designers understand really well is structuring behavior. So if we want people to move a certain direction in the game, we know prompts and nudges to encourage them to do that. Now, we're starting to see the same kind of psychology and the same kind of tricks used to direct that sort of behavior. And again, it's something that games designers understand really, really well. But again, it's something that we can go into virtual reality and test, or just straight through the games engine. I should say, if there's any questions at any point, if you throw them into the comments, I'll do my best to respond to these as they come up. Another, hopefully quite an obvious example, but sometimes one I think that is missed, is software development. Now, I come from, I suppose my PhD is firmly rooted in computer science. I come from that background. I often think games is a really useful way to learn how to be a really good computer scientist, because everything is applied. If you want to learn how to do something with a graphics card to visualize something, how to interact with a user, games gives you lots of really useful use cases on how to do that. And fundamentally, the logic of programming applies to loads of other technical industries. And I often say, if you understand how to code, then you don't necessarily need to understand programming languages at their core. If you understand the logic, then the language is largely a piece of syntax that you can pick up. But a conditional will always be a conditional. A variable will always be a variable. That basic understanding of logic-based problems, if you can understand that, you can apply it to a whole range of different fields, engineering and so on. So I say learning games programming is a fantastic way to learn to be a software developer. But beyond that, things like user interface design, you probably know some apps that you've got on your phone or your computer where they're really easy to use. You don't need any training. You can just jump in there and it's just so intuitive that you just know how to use it. Similarly, you can probably think of examples where they're really not intuitive and the settings are really weird and you don't understand how to make it do what you want it to do. That comes down to a user interaction design, so user interface design. How we design a user interface so that it's intuitive, so that people really easily understand it, is a really important part of designing good systems, designing good software. Game designers and games programmers understand this really, really well. It's part of it. You can't build a game that isn't intuitive and interactive. That's really a measure of successful games. So understanding those really well is you can apply that to a range of spaces. Optimization is another area. One of the things that we have to do in games is make sure our software works in a really slick, really seamless way. It's really optimized. Because if it's stuttering on the computer, the users are going to have a really bad experience. Now, that may be less important in certain areas of software, but what that does mean, you can make your software smaller, which might mean you can fit in additional features, might mean you can make it run faster, which might mean that users are more likely to install it and use it. I have certain pieces of software that I need to use on occasion that are absolute memory hogs. They will very, very quickly become wieldy and make my computer run really slow when I'm using them. And because of that, I'm less likely to use them and I'm less likely to recommend that software to somebody else. Optimization is really, really important. Again, from a point of green credentials as well, the more optimum you can make your software, the less energy it needs to use. Again, games developers understand this in spades. When we talk about user experience, I've mentioned that before, the user experience through a piece of software, what the user journey is, how the user feels about the software. Are they having fun? Are they enjoying the experience? Making things fun, creative, and enjoyable is exactly what games developers do. Another example is the automotive industry. And actually, for context, on the run-up to this talk, I put out on my Twitter and LinkedIn, I was asking for some feedback of areas where people have seen graduates work. And something that came back to me a lot was automotive. Now, I've seen this as well. Things like routing algorithms, so understanding how to plan routes is what we do as games developers. We do that an awful lot. And actually understanding those really carefully is really important for automotive, but very specifically the logistics industry. But also visualization. I bought a new car back in 2016. Now, I was really surprised by the process. What got loaded up to me, what got presented to me was effectively a simulation, a game. I was given, it had a picture of the car I wanted to buy. And I could change the colors, I could configure it, I could see the specifications, I could see what it looked like with different set of tires on, different wheels, different interiors. And I was sat there thinking, this is a lot like a racing game. This looks a lot to me like how you configure your car in, say, Need for Speed or something similar to that. I subsequently found out that one of my former students was involved in the development of that very system, and it was using a lot of the technologies that we use in video games. And again, that is now becoming more and more part of the car. You can go on a website for VW or your favorite car manufacturer, and you can effectively design your own car through what is effectively a game. You can build it in that configuration system. And that has also been used in things like the entertainment systems in cars. Again, not talking about building games into cars, but just the way that they interact with the users, the way that they work. A lot of those skills come from working in the games industry as well. And again, when we're talking about real-time product rendering and, like I say, being able to change the color of a vehicle during the sales process, the games industry does that very, very well. Now, one of the areas that I've done personally quite a lot of work in is the idea of education and training. Something that we've seen in relatively recent years is a shift to more simulated and virtual training solutions. Now, industries like the aircraft industry and flight training have done this for years. I think the first example of a flight simulator was developed in the late 1920s called the Link Trainer. Really interesting piece of history if you're interested. There's effectively baffles and pistons that allowed you to feel the sensation of flight without actually going up in the air. Now, this is incredibly important for specific industries because training in them can be so dangerous. Again, if you get something wrong in a plane, you can crash that plane, and that can be dangerous for not just you, but anybody who happens to be on the ground when it happens. And there is an awkward transition phase when you're learning some new skill between being facilitated in the training and doing it by yourself. So if you're learning to be a pilot, there'll be times where you'll have a trainer sat next to you, and much like learn to drive a car. When you go learn to drive a car, you will have an instructor with you who is able to take control, to pull the handbrake or do whatever if you are looking like you are losing control, or you're not in a position where you can control that vehicle. Now, but there always comes a point where the time that you can have someone sat next to you and the time that you need to do it alone has to happen. And it's quite a severe threshold. Now, what simulation potentially gives us the opportunity to do is to practice that solo skill. So not having somebody next to you, not having that safety blanket, but doing it virtually, but doing that safely. But beyond doing it safely, it gives an opportunity to do it repeatedly, cheaply. What you can taking a plane into the air costs many, many hundreds of pounds every single time you do it, especially if you're doing that with a commercial airliner, for example. Comparatively, running a simulator is much cheaper. But it also means that you can repeat the same set of circumstances. We can take a plane up in the air and we can simulate all the engines catching fire or shutting down. We can simulate that circumstance and see how the pilot responds. Are they able to still land the plane? Are they able to recover the situation? And if they're not, we can put them back up in the air and we can get them to do it again and again and again. And that simulation provides us with that opportunity. You obviously can't do that in the real world. It would be dangerous and potentially immoral to say to a pilot, right, we're now going to fly into that thunderstorm, or right, I'm now going to set your engines on fire. Let's see what happens. Obviously, we can't do that. And even if we did, we'd only ever do it once. Now, the ability to simulate means we can repeat that again and again and again. So we can provide people with much broader training. Now, fundamentally, a flight simulator, and again, as people will know, one of the best flight simulators out there is Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's incredibly accurate. It is built to a certain set of standards. And it's a game. You can go home, you can download Microsoft Flight Simulator, you can use it tomorrow. That is incredibly powerful. And again, it's using all the same things like physics simulation, rendering, real-time systems that we use in a video game. And it is a video game. But that applies to so many different areas. So again, I mentioned cars, that you can go to some driving centers and do a practice of certain driving in a simulated car. We have racing games, which are actually really high quality simulators. Here at Stafford University, we have a motion simulator driving simulator, which is very close to accurate on physics. If you can drive those race cars accurately, you can probably move into the real world and drive a real race car around a track as well. We have seen research that suggests that those skills are transferable, which is really, really useful. But again, it would be dangerous to potentially just let somebody who has never driven a race car before just straight out onto a track. But simulation potentially allows us to bridge that gap in a really useful way. There's also the options of what we call gamified education. Now, we know games are fantastic ways to learn, absolutely fantastic ways to learn. And it's one of the real kind of tragedies of education that we seem to know this really well when we're dealing with nursery children or primary school children. We use games all the time to teach. And that seems to reduce all the way through the education system. And so it's barely there at all. However, games are still really useful ways to learn. And there are things that you probably have learned through games that you don't even realize. A really good example of this is if you've ever played games like Civilization, right? The amount of history that people learn through playing those, immersing themselves in those historical simulations is massive, which is problematic when it's not entirely true. For example, there's loads of history that people know by watching films that may be just inspired by events. So again, we actually have a responsibility as games developers to present a level of accuracy and be truthful about what's accurate and what isn't. But embedding games into education is really, really, really powerful. And more industries are starting to see this. Certainly, things like mandatory training now that a lot of companies do, they embed games into that process. They have a score, they have a quiz, they're doing things that create a level of competition, even if that competition is only against yourself. And games developers are heavily involved in those processes. One of my contacts said, actually, we look for games developers as learning designers. So people who actually design the learning experience because they can make it fun, they can make it interactive, and they can make it engaging. And that is fundamentally what a games scholar knows intuitively and really, really well. But there's also things like on the very basic level of the skills, instructional content production. So animation, VFX, we're using a lot more film production skills, but specifically from kind of games animation areas in how we're designing content production. And again, if you don't believe me, watch anything on BBC, on CBBC, when they're talking about explaining specific contexts, they will then break out into an animation. Now, a lot of those will have designed by people who've got games skills behind them. So yeah, education training, massive. And I'll talk about a very specific example I've done with education training towards the end. Another example that I'd like to discuss is product development. So again, one of the things that we're seeing increasingly now is So I've just seen an interesting comment in the chat. Typically, what would be the titles of jobs that other industries may offer to game designers? That's a really hard question to answer because there is a job titles change all the time, even my job. So here I'm called the head of department. At another university, I might be called a head of school or a school director, or titles tend to be things that you find within industries. But typically, if you go on to something like your favorite jobs board and you look for anything that says real time in the job title, that's something that game designers, games developers, games artists are going to probably be suitable for. Interactive, interaction, experience, those kind of keywords is what you tend to see popping up in those titles. Experience designer, interaction designer, learning designer. Those kind of titles you'll tend to see. But I would say look beyond the titles. As I mentioned, titles are often, I wouldn't say meaningless, and there are some industries that have pretty set job titles. But they do vary from company to company to company, and looking very specific, even within the games industry, what you may call a designer. A games designer at one company may be very different to what a games designer is at another. In some places, it's all about the actual gameplay systems. In another place, it might actually be more about 3D content. In another place, it might be about technical implementation through the games engine. The key is to look at the job requirements. And again, don't exclude yourself because of a title. Look more at the skills that they're looking for and how you can apply yourself to them. So hopefully that answers your question, Stardust, and by all means, throw in another comment if you have other questions. Just to go back to product development, we're seeing this real move to more computer-aided design, so CAD, and we're seeing a lot of people doing things like CAD systems development. So one of my former employers, actually, one of my when I first went back into academia, moved into working in a product development company building systems for 3D printers. Again, why? Because games developers understand the world in 3D, and they did very well in that space, and I think they've moved to another company since. We're also seeing industrial concept design illustrations a lot more. We used to be building a lot more prototypes in things like clay or foam board and things like that, which is a really, really expensive process. Now that still happens, absolutely it does, and it's not a skill that's going away anytime soon. But the ability to design, render relatively good, high-quality visualizations for a product before it's even produced or developed or completing its design is more useful. We want to do, as I mentioned in another area, we want to do as much testing as we can as early in the process as we can, because the more testing we can do at the beginning, it means that the final product is more likely to meet our needs. So we're seeing a lot of that in the product development design space, including things like 3D modeling and simulation. One of the ways that we can look at games engines is that they are simulations of something. So if we play a racing game and we, say, spin the car, we are simulating a certain type of physics interaction. And again, we do that an awful lot in games. We do material deformation. We do we look at drag and things like that in actually how we make things move through the world. Again, one thing I've seen, and specifically relatively experienced games developers go into, is this space of simulation specific for a product. It's a really, really exciting area. It's an area that's more likely to get more roles as we go through the time, because regulations are changing. And actually, there's so many regulations now that say certain classes of products have to be simulated before they get released to the real world. So we've seen whole companies developing that their entire purpose is just to simulate new products. One I'd like to talk about a little bit more from personal experience is heritage. Now, I've come at this from very much an educational perspective. I've worked with a couple of museums on building interactive exhibits. So one of the big challenges we have in museums is everything's behind a case. So you can see this fantastic, I mean, in the example here, this is one of my colleagues, Emma, who's doing research around ceramics and how we interact with ceramics, Stoke being famous for its ceramic industry. But they're fragile. Pots, vases, they're all quite fragile things, especially when they're old. And what we can't do is take this potentially priceless piece of pottery and give it to somebody to fiddle with, and because they might drop it, and then suddenly our priceless piece of pottery is not so priceless garden drainage at that point. It's just broken. But we can do that in virtual reality. We can see it, we can touch it, we can interact with it. If something is in a case, we can only see the side that we are presented. But what about the other side? What's on the other side of the exhibit is sometimes quite interesting. A good example of this is paintings, right? One of the things that you'll see an appraiser do when they're trying to value a painting is they turn it around and they look at the back. How has that painting been sealed in there? Are there any additional marks? Is there a signature in the frame? What is on the back of the painting? And that is something we will never see walking through a gallery. And maybe it's something the artist never intended us to see. Maybe that's a different question. But the ability to render things in virtual reality means we can spin them around. We can look at them. We can, through things like the gloves, we can get a sense of touch. And it can give us a sense of an idea of how these things were used. Again, one of the things that we've done typically in say, dig sites is we might recreate something. So we see a certain sort of spoon or a certain sort of device, and we don't know what this tool is. So we'll recreate it, we'll try and use it. Does it work as we think it works? We've learned a lot, for example, of traditional forging techniques by trying to recreate them and trying to kind of reverse engineer that understanding. And we can do that virtually. We can do a lot of that. We can really kind of get an idea of how these things work. I've just seen another comment come into the chat. From an architectural point of view, I think there was an opportunity for gamified simulation. Tells a lot about that. Exactly. This is exactly the point I'm trying to make. Simulation can give us a real understanding about how things were done. If anyone's watched The Time Team, I don't know if you still know if they still make The Time Team. Maybe somebody in the chat can tell me. One of the things they always used to do in The Time Team was render. When they were digging up a building and they were trying to show what it looked like, they would then try and render in 3D what this building probably looked like in the Roman times or Vikings or whatever it was, to give you a sense of scale and give you also a sense of how the space was used. We talked about the architecture piece, where what we're trying to do at the beginning of an architectural project is understand how the space is used before we actually build it. Well, that works well in reverse as well. If something is no longer in use, how that was used, how the flow through that building was, is potentially lost. But if we create it and we actually try to use that space, maybe as it was intended, what does that tell us about class relationships between servants and building owners and things? What do we understand about how space was used in society? Space and place, how we use space and how we use place, is incredibly important to understanding culture. And actually, through simulation, gamified simulation, we can do a lot of that work. And again, that all comes under this broad heading of historical visualization. The the work I did, they still do Time Team. It's online now rather than on TV. Brilliant. I actually used to work with one of the archaeologists in Time Team several years ago. It's one of my very few claims to fame. That whole simulation piece, that whole understanding piece is incredibly important from for an archaeologist. It gives them a whole new set of tools, and games design is a really well placed to do that. We also have so many spaces in archaeology and museums where we may not have a complete piece and we're having to make guesses. So you may only have a fraction of a piece of pottery. Or what did the whole pot look like? Can we render it in 3D? Can we scan that pot in and preserve it for future generations? One of my colleagues, Stuart Butler, is currently working on a project to try and capture automotive heritage, because cars won't be around in their current format forever. You know, if we suddenly change the law and outlaw fossil fuels, which is conceivable, that might happen in the future. What happens to the cars that use those fossil fuels? Will they be preserved? Well, there's only so much space we have to store and preserve things. Will they be allowed to rust? Will they get scrapped? Well, that would be a real shame. That's part of our history. That's part of our culture. That's part of our heritage. And preserving that, there's a level of responsibility for that. So we are using modern game systems, modern game technologies to capture and preserve that heritage, which is, I think, really important. The work I did in museums was actually showing underwater scenes. There are things that you can't pick up and put in the museum, and there's some things you shouldn't pick up and put in a museum. For example, the bow of the Titanic, right? You can't and you shouldn't. That's effectively a living tomb. It's part of its environment. Even if we could recover it, we shouldn't recover it. But we can make that in virtual reality, and we can give people the experience of seeing what that is like and what it is to be that. We can recreate things like dinosaur skeletons. We can flesh them out. We can animate them in space. We can give people that experience. And that living heritage is incredibly valuable. We also have to understand that the mindset of people attending museums has changed over years. In the days before kind of real-time entertainment, before films, before all this was really accessible, museums were, I suppose, a much more unique attraction. But now people come to expect interaction in what they see, and they come to expect interaction in what they do. So again, game design is a really well place to do that. And I suggest, if you really like a museum, if you, and again, fundamentally recommend supporting museums, go visit, go have a look. They're absolute massive repositories of knowledge. But there are things where we're starting to see a change in the way that they engage and the way that they use. And again, it started with little videos around exhibits 20 odd years ago to now full-on game-based simulations. And I think that's really interesting. And certainly a thing that games designers, game developers, games artists can be heavily involved with. Now that's it for my talk. Unless there are any questions left, one of the things I will ask my colleagues, Jamie and Ben, to do is share the feedback form. Really interested in getting feedback. This is something that we're really keen to know more and do more of these presentations. So please fill out the feedback form when we get a chance. Hi, Chris. Do you have any examples of transferable skills to both sports or music industry? Or doing lectures for former staff have students with experience in those areas? Yes. So certainly in the music industry, one of the things that I've seen quite a lot of is that there's a much closer link between audio production in the music industry and audio production that is in the games industry now. And we're seeing a lot more transfer, people moving left and right. Certainly I've known people who've been audio programmers or audio engineers in the games industry have moved into the music industry and the other direction. In sports, yes, sport is a really, really interesting one, specifically around things like motion capture. Now, one of the things that we do with games quite a lot is, if we're trying to animate something, we can animate it by hand. If we want to make that animation look as realistic as possible, we'll often capture the motion using the motion capture facility. Now, we have a massive one at Stafford University, and if you want more information about that, Ben Rimmer, who is one of the hosts of the Christmas lectures, find his details, email him, Maybe his email will pop up in the comments in a second. But the same technology we use to capture motion for animation can also be used for sport. So it can be used to assess performance, but biomechanics, and that can again feed into things like performance management and performance coaching. Certainly an interesting one for this is esports. Now, there are other lectures going on around esports during the Christmas lectures. So again, I encourage you to jump onto those. But we're seeing a lot of movement from the sports industry into the esports industry around performance management, performance coaching. So yes, it does tend to go two ways. Sports specifically, I've known a couple of people, not many, from the sports industry move into the games industry as advisors. So biomechanics advisors, how do people move in certain circumstances? We tend to see this a lot in sports games or high active games, martial arts, that type of thing. But we also are seeing a lot of people move from the games industry into sports, specifically on the technology side about how to capture that motion in a way that the data is useful. And again, there's this idea of motion replay. So we can have, for example, a high jumper. We can record their motion doing the high jump. We can capture all that motion using a motion capture suit. We can then replay that. So the person can see, oh, well, you dropped your arm at this point. Well, maybe if you'd stepped a little earlier at this, and we can kind of use that to feed into the advice that they're given. We did this already through things like video capture, video replays, but video replays only work if you're capturing the very specific angle you want to assess. The advantage with motion capture is we can completely rotate, we can look from new angles, we can slow things down in a very, very different way. So again, we're starting to see a lot more of that in the sports industry. Will these streams stay in case we want to rewatch them? Yes, what we're planning to do is you should be able to watch these, but we're also going to hopefully try to re-upload them so they're a little bit more visible. And on that, again, I would very kindly ask if you could have time to fill out the feedback form. It's in the chat. It's from the Staff's Game Development account, forms.microsoft, just up on the screen there. If you have a chance to fill out the form, I'd be incredibly grateful. We want to do more of these talks, and your feedback really helps drive at that. Other than that, happy holidays, and we are incredibly proud to be Staffs, and this is our 20 years of games. And thank you very much.